Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our discussion of globalization and immigration in contemporary Europe, right? So we are now actually deep into our Unit 9 core selection of our AP European History curriculum, right? We're very now much moving into the movements and patterns of migration and immigration in contemporary Europe, coupled with the growing ideas of globalization in the modern economic sense, okay? So we spent the entire class doing our Socratic seminar, discussing our Think, Pair, Share activity, discussing globalization over here, what that means, talking about the expansion of multinational corporations like Siemens and Deutsche Bank, right? And talking about the growth of the actual automatic and international stock market, right? We talked about the positives and the negatives, of course, of the growing economies. We talked about global recessions being one of those major negatives and how the 2008 housing crisis in the United States actually led to a series of contemporary economic downfalls in Europe. But then we began to move into the human side of globalization, right? We're now beginning to talk about specific instances in our curriculum where we have discussed migration and immigration, right? Irish immigration in the 19th century, Italian immigration in the 19th century, pre and post World War II immigration. And we discussed how hardship is a major factor and contributor to the movement of all these different people that we looked at with this map, right? So we started discussing a lot of different ideas and a lot of different modalities that have to do with the movement of people in and out of contemporary Europe and how that's affecting the globalized society that we live in today. We're talking about how the face of immigration is also beginning to change, and it's also beginning to change the very much the fabric and the patterns of multiculturalism and also different cultures in contemporary Europe. So a big one that we're going to be focusing on today as well is going to be contemporary Germany, right? We're going to be talking a lot and relating a lot of these ideas back to contemporary Germany, post-World War II, post-reunification, and how Germany and the scene and the contemporary German and how the contemporary German culture and the outline of their society today really does mirror open door policies of immigration as well as more ideas of how to embrace multiculturalism, right? So let's go ahead and get into it a little bit. This is where we left off in class. We're now talking about the changing immigration flows in modern Europe, right? So looking at the entire outline of this idea, immigration patterns, you have to understand, have changed drastically over European history. When you look at the breadth of European history, there was a point in the 19th century, 1800s, where Europe was actually a very large source for migrants that were heading to other areas, right? For example, like we talked about in class during our Socratic seminar, Italian immigration of the late 19th century, heavily into the United States and Latin America. We've got a lot of different movements of people in and out of this particular continent. Now, another big thing that you need to understand is that immigration has also changed heavily just in the last few decades. And there was a massive legal labor influx from North Africa and Turkey in the 1960s and 70s when workers were being brought in to actually replace waning manufacturing jobs and also to work in construction and the rebuilding of many European nations post-World War II, post-reunification, and also during the Cold War era. Now, this is a really interesting facet, though, because as this legal labor influx began, it began to lead to a very different changing identity of Europe in the 1960s and 70s. But then as time went on and manufacturing and globalization took effect, there began to be a large stoppage of bringing in labor from other different areas, right? And so we understand the fact that that is something very important to compare to as well, different areas of other type of movement throughout the European continent during the 1960s and 70s as well. Because you've also got, during the 60s and 70s, the waning collapse of the Soviet Union. Civil war in Yugoslavia that would break out in the 80s and 90s. You've also got refugees from Rwanda, Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, very heavily moving into the European continent. So as you can see, not only were people being brought in legally for labor forces, but also there was a massive amount of movement and internal migrations throughout the European continent itself. For example, this is a very famous photograph right here of a East German soldier jumping over the Berlin Wall during its construction in the earliest phase, or when Germany was still divided into East and Western Germany. So when we're looking at this entire idea as well, just to relate it back to us in the United States, you also have to understand that immigration is something that we deal with a lot as a country, just like anyone else does, and Europeans deal with as well. But looking at the statistics, 300,000 people immigrate illegally to the U.S. per year. 500,000 actually immigrate to the EU per year. So it's important to understand that these ideas of immigration and the flow of people over borders is happening in every single continent and every single place, and that the ideas of how they move and why they move does change drastically over time. Now, one of the biggest reasons why there's a large influx of people into contemporary Europe today, especially into contemporary Germany as well today, is because of diasporas and asylum seeking. Now, by 2005, immigrants composed about 10% of most Western European nations, which is a drastic uptick, okay? When we were comparing it again back to the 1960s and 70s, when workers were being brought in to actually do certain jobs and perform certain tasks legally throughout most of the European continent, like we said from North Africa and Turkey, that is going to be one modality of this immigration. However, there's going to be major life events and major historical events that are going to lead to large-scale diasporas throughout the European continent as well. From 1960 to 2006, specifically looking at some statistics that demonstrate to us the growing multiculturalism and the growing the growing amount of immigrants within the continent is very, very important to understand. For example, if you look at the Netherlands, they went from 1% immigrant body to 10% immigrant body from the years of 1960 to 2006. Same thing in Germany, 1.2% to 12.3%, probably the largest and highest jump for most of the continental nations. And then France, you've got 4.7% to 11% in just this short amount of time. So as you can see, what is causing all of these different ideas? What is causing all of this movement? It's very important to understand this, right? And what we can refer to most of these movements in the modern era, especially in contemporary Europe, is known as a diaspora. Now, a diaspora is when enclaves of ethnic groups settle outside of their homeland, right? Go ahead and jot that down in your notes and stuff like that, because it's going to be a major talking point for us tomorrow when we actually do our gallery walk activity that we're going to be doing with this Al Jazeera article and this Reuters article that is actually referencing the movement of Syrian refugees and Ukrainian refugees, right? Diasporas are very important to understand. That idea of the movement of people to places outside of their homeland, right? You can also see this multiple times throughout history. We actually talk about this in my Western civilizations class when we discuss the diaspora of the Jewish people following the Assyrian takeover in the literally in the 2000s BC. So when we're looking at this as well going forward, you have to understand that this is going to lead to a very, very changing idea of Europe, right? We've got these large amounts of immigrants moving into these different areas, and you'll see it take effect in the most small ways and in the biggest ways that you've ever seen as well. For example, some of y'all are probably football fans, right? So Arsenal in 1950, if we look at a photo of their championship season in 1950, look at the racial makeup of this team. It is nothing but actual European descendant, probably mostly English white men, right? But if you look at a team photo of Arsenal now, due to the multiple different diasporas and due to the different immigration patterns of contemporary Europe, you've got an insanely multicultural team that actually has representatives from almost every single ethnic group and almost every single continent, right? So that's a very, very beautiful thing to see because it's actually creating much more of a growing sense of identity and then also much more of a growing sense of exposure to many different cultures for the youth and as well as for developing nations. Now, looking at it going forward as well, how do you embrace this new concept of multiculturalism? So first of all, let's talk about what multiculturalism is. Multiculturalism is the mixing of ethnic styles in daily life and in cultural works, right? i.e. art, film, music, anything you could really, really think of, right? Immigration and these new cultures are bringing a beautiful new array of diversity to European societies, right? Now, we could talk about that all day long. I could read directly off this slide. I could show you these different ideas and be like, but then you could easily just mute this video. But that's not what we're here for, right? In our flipped lessons, we are here to make sure that you're receiving all that direct instruction at home and getting those good examples that I have to explain, which is going to actually cause us to have a very, very engaging review-based set in class, right? So let's talk about some of these examples of multiculturalism that are happening in big ways and in small ways as well, right? Now, one of my favorite ones to talk about is, of course, art and writing, okay? So, for example, these two texts right here, one being, well, first of all, this is originally a series of short stories, but now it's a very, very famous film, The Namesake, and also Zadie Smith's White Teeth, right? So looking at the understanding of these two stories, The Namesake is actually about a young man, okay, this will hit a little bit closer to home, to give you an idea of multiculturalism in the United States, The Namesake is actually about a young man of Indian descent who has actually moved to New York City with his parents. In New York City, his parents have sacrificed a lot to try and give him the best life that he possibly can. But he wants to strike out and blaze his own path while still not leaving his culture behind, right? It's a very beautiful film, and I highly suggest that you watch it if you give him the chance. And then, of course, right here, White Teeth by Zadie Smith is actually a very, very fantastic novel that is set in Great Britain, which actually discusses the relationship between a person of Bengali descent and a person of British descent and how these two cultures collide, right? So looking at just those ideas right there, that's a very, very good example of like multiculturalism in fiction and in nonfiction as well. Well, looking at this as well, look at the national dishes of the United Kingdom today. Fish and chips, of course, but then also chicken tikka masala. This is due to the heavy amount of like Indian and also Southeast Asian immigration and Pakistani immigration into the United Kingdom. And this was actually declared in the early 2000s that chicken tikka masala should be one of the national dishes of the United Kingdom, right? How cool is that? And then also you can see it as well in music, right? This is a now actually pretty popular, pretty famous Algerian rye musician. His name is actually Cheb Khaled, and he actually led like a very, very large movement of actually synthesizing North African music with French music, with US rap, and also folk music from Africa as well to create a new sound known as rye music, right? And he has one of his most famous songs is called To Flee But Where he actually discusses the ideas of living in France around other Algerians and as well as other North African people, but being an Islamic man and trying to actually synthesize the ideas of his culture and his life in this new area, right? So looking at the entire thing, but how do we embrace this idea? Well, the hard thing about it is there are obstacles to this embrace. Most of us, the overwhelming population of us, are happy and excited to embrace the concepts of multiculturalism. But the thing about it is there are some obstacles that we as like contemporary like thinkers and as modern thinkers need to be ready to actually sense coming down the road. How do we look at these obstacles and how do we get over them so that we can actually create an embracing lifestyle for all, right? So, well, first and foremost, something that we need to understand is that Western societies are also sometimes very unaware of outside cultures. This is something that we need to work towards doing to actually educate our youth better and actually get, of course, grow their ideas in global competency, right? That is another large thing as well, is that there is a lack of global competency for many different people in contemporary European societies, in American societies especially. So we need to grow that global competency, understand where people are from, how does their culture affect their background, their language, their accent, their food, their everything, and how can we blend that in and to like give each other the best qualities of all of our different cultures. Now, another big thing as well is that there is a huge issue of fear-mongering and political divides. What has now happened actually in the modern era is certain political divisions have actually grabbed onto ideas that have actually occurred during the 90s and early thousands, of course, mostly actually discussing large-scale violence, right? This, of course, being one of the larger terrorist attacks that occurred in Madrid, right? So the thing about it is, though, it's very, very important for us to actually be able to have a discussion with people that maybe have been told that they should be afraid, right? When they shouldn't be afraid, because the overwhelming majority of migrants actually are one, hugely in favor of democracy, hugely in favor of natural rights and freedoms, and are here seeking asylum, right? So we need to be our doors open, and we need to actually create more of these different ideas going forward. Now, it is a thing that is difficult to struggle with. It is a thing, though, that still happens all the time. So when I see you tomorrow in class, what we're going to be actually doing is we're actually going to be reading an Al Jazeera article and a Reuters article, which is going to be discussing how Syrian refugees in contemporary Germany feel as though kind of scorned due to the fact that Ukrainian refugees are receiving a very, very open doors welcome, while Syrian refugees dealt with many, many hardships as they were leaving their home and fleeing due to civil war. We'll talk about all the ideas of those wars, we'll outline those wars in class as well, and we'll discuss a modern day diaspora from two different points of view. We'll do a gallery walk and we'll check out all y'all's great work, but I'll see y'all soon.